welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today at our webinar, which is entitled "What Keeps Innovative Technologies from Patients?" This is part of our ongoing health policy webinar series here at the Stanford Mussallem Center for Biodesign. I'm Sandy Ruggles. I'm your moderator today and the Director of Policy Research here at Stanford Biodesign. And I'm delighted to welcome our panel who is going to be providing their expertise today on this topic. Molly, if you go to the next slide, we'll give everybody a quick rundown of who our panelists are and what you can expect over the next hour of your time. And so today we're going to be focusing on uh, a particular class of new type of technology called a breakthrough device. And that's a designation that has in a program that is directed by the FDA, but it's also connected to a series of programs at Medicare and that are associated with payment and associated with coverage. And so we've assembled this panel of experts to talk today about that process of going from FDA and FDA evaluation and authorization of a new technology through to the establishment of codes, coverage, and payment for that new technology. This is a topic area that we've had a lot of interest in here on the policy team and have focused our research interests in. And it's especially important because uh, within the innovation community, this time period between the FDA authorization and the establishment of commercial availabilities frequently called the Valley of Death. And it's called the Valley of Death because of the variety of different steps and the challenges associated with with reimbursement, particularly all of these different components: code, coverage, and payment. So the focus today is going to be on progressing through that set of steps. We've got Nancy Isaac, who is our Director of Regulatory Policy here at Biodesign. Nancy comes with many years of experience with taking products through FDA, submitting them both for evaluation and authorization, and as well has shepherded multiple breakthrough devices through the FDA process. So she's going to be centering us on what a breakthrough device is and how that program works at the FDA. Next, we have Rudy Missmar. He's a principal at FHP. And FHP Strategies is and his work at FHP Strategies focuses on payment models for new technology, particularly pass-through codes and NTAP. So he's going to be talking to and speaking to how breakthrough devices are evaluated by Medicare for these pass-through payments. Next, we'll have Dan Waldmann. He's the EVP of Health Policy and Reimbursement at the Medical Device Manufacturers Association. A huge amount of experience in many different aspects of health policy, but particularly a focus on how Medicare establishes coverage, particularly for new technologies. And so all of that is going to be about talking to and explaining each of these different steps. And then we'll have Shri Raghunathan, who's the CEO of Noctrix Health. Shri is going to give us a real world experience associated with traversing these steps. Noctrix is commercializing a novel neuromodulation therapy for restless leg syndrome, and that technology was designated as a breakthrough device at FDA. So we're going to get all kinds of different perspectives here. Each of our panelists is going to have about 10 minutes. And then we'll do a panel discussion at the end where we address a couple of different questions. So I hope you enjoy our next hour. We're looking forward to speaking to all of this, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what our experts have to say. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy and ask you to take it away, Nancy. We'll go to your first slide.
Thank you, Sandy. And it's my honor to be here with this panel and talk about what I find a very uh, regulatorily fun area at FDA, and this is the Breakthrough Device Designation. So this program has been evolving for a while. Back, I think around 2011, FDA ran a pilot program to try to bring innovative technologies forward faster that evolved into the expedited access pathway, and then with the 21st Century Cures Act, settled down to be called the Breakthrough Program. And in order to take advantage of these uh, things that you get from FDA with breakthrough designation, your product has to meet certain qualifications. But first of all, the program is intended to try to help bring important new products, innovative products that address life-threatening conditions, et cetera, to the market faster. And FDA explicitly states that they don't change their statutory standards or requirements for pre-market approval, 510(k) or de novo, but they do offer additional tools to try to help bring this technology forward and give it more attention, give it more interaction with the companies, et cetera. So it's an important program that FDA has been working on for a long time. And this particular breakthrough designation is necessary for you to be, you have to get this designation in order to participate in the program. So why would you want it? This interactive and timely communication with FDA via what they call sprint meetings is really important. And for small companies to have to wait the normal time for a meeting with FDA, which is about 70 days, you can have these sprint meetings and start interactions with FDA in a matter of weeks. And with the objective to have the single issue sprint meeting resolved within 45 days. So that's a real advantage for companies. Also, they are selecting staff at FDA that have expedited pathway experience, that are familiar with the regulatory tools, and with senior management oversight and engagement can help resolve issues while you're in your development program. There was a program a long time ago at FDA for priority review. This is folded into the breakthrough designation. And I looked at some of the data. It is true the PMAs and de novos do go through slightly faster. I don't have data on the full development spectrum, but the actual review times are faster. They aren't significant with respect to 510(k), but 510(k)s tend to go through, well, they go through faster and have statutory review times that are faster than PMA and de novo anyway. And then they have this pre versus post-market balance of data collection, which I'll talk about again in a moment. Next slide, please. So how do you get it? You request through what's called a pre-submission process, and there's a guidance document on how to do the pre-sub, but it's also outlined in the breakthrough guidance. And FDA will contact you usually within 30 days with any questions they have or requests for additional information, and then the response is due within 60 days. So how do you do it? You fill out this, it's about 20, 25 pages. The important part here is the proposed indications for use. So what it is you're addressing and in what population, et cetera. And you have to meet the designation criteria 1 and at least one of the designation criteria 2, A, B, C, or D. So let's walk through those. So of course it has to provide for a more effective treatment or diagnosis of a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating disease or condition. It can't be something that's short-lived or self-limiting. It really has to meet that first criteria. If it doesn't meet that criteria, it may be eligible for other programs at FDA, the STEP program, but for this program, you must meet criteria 1. And then of criteria 2, it has to represent a breakthrough technology, which means it could be a novel technology or a novel way to apply an existing technology for which there is no approved or cleared alternative, and that it offers significant advantages over existing approved or cleared alternatives. That can be reduced hospital stay or eliminating a hospital stay, improving patient compliance, improving quality of life, et cetera. And then D, device availability of which is in the best interest of the patient. So there has been a focus on patient voice, and FDA does use patient preference data and looks at that for the criteria D, but also, is it going to help them with their day-to-day living? Is it going to help them cope with what they're doing better, with these life-threatening or severely limiting diseases? And then there is this requirement to provide both that the technology is feasible as well as there's a potential for the clinical benefit that you're stating. So, in my experience, it does require some limited clinical data to show both of those features. Okay, next. So, as I mentioned, there was an initial guidance and it was updated in September 23. Then it clarified and added some additional factors. FDA is really looking to promote health equity. They're looking at new and existing technologies that address those. They're also, because of the Support Act, the opioid crisis in the United States, they're looking at products that can help with pain or addiction. And then also transparency. It disclosed the way FDA would be discussing breakthrough status. It doesn't publish whether or not a company achieved breakthrough designation, but they do talk about how many they got and the approvals or clearances or marketing authorizations under those breakthroughs are published. Next slide. So as of midway last year, there were 1,176 breakthrough designations, with the vast majority being in the Center of Devices in Radiological Health. There are a few over in CBER. And as I mentioned, the expedited access pathway in the history, they pulled those ones in because it was a very similar program. Now, how many actually made it through? 160 marketing authorizations made it all the way through. Now, that's less than 14%. And again, the vast majority on CDRH. But if you look at the designations, you can see the chart here over on the right. They peaked in 2021. So there is a lag time between obtaining the designation and getting all the way through, if you make it, to applying for marketing authorization. So I would expect a lag there. And as is published by FDA, the majority of designations are in the cardio group. There were 243, in the neuro group or OHT5, 189, and ortho, 161. Now, I was a little surprised to see ortho up there because you don't really think about it as being life-threatening, but there are osteoarthritis issues that are irreversible. And also, FDA has the ability to reach out to companies that they think would be good candidates for the Breakthrough Designation Program. And I know that Admiral Pete in OHT6 Ortho did do that with a number of companies. And then for therapeutic devices, most of them required clinical data in their marketing authorization. About 40% required post-marketing. And then there, as I mentioned earlier, there is a benefit for the review time. And we're going to continue to watch to see whether or not those review times continue to be more expedited than the standard review times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was a great overview of the FDA side of this program. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to turn to both Rudy and then Dan, who are going to talk about the ways that now, once having established a marketing authorization through FDA, how some the programs at CMS where a breakthrough designated device and where that breakthrough designation is linked to different programmatic evaluation criteria. So we'll have Rudy, you're going to go first here, and he's going to talk about payment programs.
Great. Thanks, Sandy, and thank you to the Biodesign team for inviting me to talk today about Medicare payment challenges to breakthrough devices. So I wanted to start by addressing a common misconception, and that is that if you have FDA breakthrough status, it's a golden ticket that guarantees Medicare payment. And the reality is that is not true. So breakthrough status does not guarantee Medicare payment. Medicare payment varies by setting of care, and I'm going to focus on the two Medicare payment systems where breakthrough has the biggest impact. And that's the Inpatient Prospective Payment System, or IPPS, that covers the inpatient side, where hospitals get bundled payments for the inpatient stay, This is often referred to as the MSDRG bundled payment. And I'm also going to talk about the outpatient prospective payment system, or OPPS, and that covers the outpatient side, where hospitals also get bundled payments for services performed on the same day. And those are called or referred to often as the APC payments. Now, because these bundled rates are based on historical Medicare data, they often fail to cover the cost of brand new technologies. So, to fix this, years ago, Congress mandated that CMS provide temporary add-on payments for new devices in addition to the bundled payments that hospitals receive. And the goal for these temporary add-on payments, they would last 2 to 3 years, is that hospitals will use these devices and these technologies during that time period, given the additional payment. And then CMS will look at the claims data over that period to recalibrate the bundled payments. And then after that 2 to 3 year additional payment for the devices, those technologies would go back into the bundle and now a recalibrated payment bundle. Now, the advantage to having Breakthrough here is that it gives you an alternative pathway to apply for these add-on payments using easier criteria. And I want to note that if you do get these add-on payments for your Breakthrough device, it only applies for the specific indication designated as Breakthrough. So if you could go to the next slide. I'm going to start with the new technology add-on payment, often referred to as NTAP. And this is the add-on payment on the inpatient side. So the actual add-on payment amount, it's not a fixed rate, but it is capped at 65% of the cost of the device. A hospital can get less than that, but they can't get more than that amount as an add-on payment. Manufacturers apply for the NTAP and they do so on a fiscal year basis. You don't need FDA approval to submit your NTAP, but, and this is important, you have to have FDA approval. You have to be FDA approved by May 1st, prior to when the NTAP payments start in October of that fiscal year. Now, for Breakthrough devices, the advantage is that CMS waives two major NTAP criteria. First, you don't have to prove that your device is a substantial clinical improvement over existing devices. That's a huge advantage because it's the number one reason for NTAP denials. So you don't need to show that type of clinical data. Number two, they also waive the newness criterion where you have to prove that you're distinct from existing devices and that you're not substantially similar. So you don't have to meet that criteria. And that also is a reason for many NTAP denials. But you do have to meet the cost criterion. That's not waived. And it's not enough to just say on the application, we're expensive. You have to prove that the cost of the hospital cases that use your devices or use your device would exceed a cost threshold that is set by CMS. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to now talk about the add-on payment mechanism on the outpatient side, and that's called the transitional pass-through payment. It also applies to devices used in the ambulatory surgical center. Just like NTAP, it's not a fixed payment rate. Instead, here, CMS will pay the hospital an additional payment for the device, but then they'll subtract from the bundled payment that the hospital also gets an amount that's already allocated for devices in that bundled payment. So the idea here is to prevent double dipping. They're not going to pay the bundled payment to the hospital that already has a component to account for the devices, and then also an additional separate payment for the devices. Now, for Breakthrough, the advantage here, just like NTAP, is you don't have to meet the substantial clinical improvement criterion. It's waived. But unlike NTAP on the inpatient side, the transitional pass-through does not give you a pass on newness. And you have to prove here that you don't fit into an existing pass-through category. The difficulty with meeting this criterion is that CMS has created over 130 pass-through categories since the inception of the pass-through program in 2000. And some of these are defined very broadly, like guiding catheter. So CMS might deny you by saying, you fit into this category we created 25 years ago, even though your technology is revolutionary. It's a clear advancement on other guiding catheters. If you meet that description of that pass-through category, that's a hurdle, and that's something that you have to address in your application. You also have to meet the cost criterion, just like NTAP. It's a little bit of a different test, and I'll go through some of the challenges with this particular criterion in the next slide. So if you could go to the last slide. So even though these add-on mechanisms are great and they're easier to meet for breakthrough devices, because I talked about some of the criteria that's waived, I do want to highlight some challenges that exist that you should be aware of. And first, I'll talk about the challenges on the NTAP side. The first challenge on the NTAP side is the deadline, the FDA approval deadline that I talked about. Sorry, if you could go to the next slide. I don't know if it's stuck. Just want to make sure it's corresponding with what I'm saying. Anyway, yep, great, thank you. The first challenge with the NTAP is this deadline that I talked about. So if you get approval a day after the May 1st deadline, so you get approved on May 2nd, you miss that NTAP window and you have to apply for the next fiscal year, which delays NTAP payments considerably. Now, one thing CMS could potentially do to address this would be to conditionally approve the NTAP for these late breakers. So approve the NTAP without FDA approval, but only pay after approval is granted, and that could be mid-year. That's something that they've done for some products under NTAP, antimicrobials. It's something they could potentially extend to breakthrough devices. Another challenge on the NTAP side is the payment level. Like I said, there's a 65% cap. That forces some hospitals to absorb losses on expensive devices. A potential way to address this would be for CMS to increase the add-on. Again, there's some precedent here where CMS pays 75% for antimicrobials who have NTAPs and certain sickle cell gene therapy products. Now, for pass-through, one of the biggest challenges, again, is this newness category issue that I talked about earlier. These broadly written legacy categories can block breakthrough devices from meeting the newness criteria. One way to address this would potentially be for CMS to say, okay, we're going to waive this category, very similar or a corollary to how they waive substantially similar newness on the NTAP side. And then finally, the cost criterion for transitional pass-through could be a problem for devices that are additive. So what I'm talking about here are devices that add to instead of replace existing devices or tools in a procedure. And that's because as part of that cost test, CMS is determining if the cost of your device is significant by comparing your cost to the cost of devices that are already used in the procedure. So, just to give you an example, if you have a $2,000 breakthrough device and it's for a procedure that already uses a $20,000 implant, CMS is going to compare you against that massive $20,000 bucket. So your costs are going to look insignificant and you're not going to meet the cost criterion. Something they could do could be to modify that cost criterion to deal with these types of devices. So to conclude, and I know I've talked about a lot of information and it's kind of dense, but if you take anything away from this particular presentation, it's that Breakthrough, yes, is a powerful tool, but it's not a golden ticket to Medicare payment. The biggest advantage is it allows you access to these alternative add-on pathways, but that waive some of the criteria, but they don't completely eliminate the criteria. And at the end of the day, it's really important to have a Medicare reimbursement strategy way before FDA approval that takes into account the potential Medicare payment systems that apply and the add-on mechanisms so that there are no surprises once you're approved. So thank you for bearing with me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Rudy. That was great. We're going to transition here to Dan, and Dan's going to focus on the other side of the coin. If we've got payment and coding covered by Rudy, Dan's going to talk here about coverage, and in particular, establishing coverage for new technologies and these programs that are emerging that are linked to breakthrough devices. So take it away, Dan.
Thank you, Sandy. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Really appreciate all the work that the Mussallem Center does. The research that the center puts together has been really influential in Washington, especially related to these programs I'm talking about today, and really putting concrete information around the lag between FDA approval and coverage in Medicare. So first thing I want to follow on Rudy's excellent presentation there, and just clarify one thing for people that they need to understand, and I encounter a lot of confusion around this point, and that is the substantial clinical improvement determination that is involved in NTAP and TPT, and which is satisfied by breakthrough device designation, is not a coverage determination. It is a coding and payment determination, but it is not overseen by the coverage analysis group. It is all done by the payment staff and the coding staff. So people really don't understand, and they don't understand why they qualify for NTAP and TPT, and then they go out and try to get a MAC or a Medicare Advantage plan to cover them, and they don't understand, well, I've been deemed to be substantially clinical, to be a substantial clinical improvement. It's really important to understand you still have, you're starting really from square one, even if you have TPT or NTAP when it comes to coverage. Breakthrough device designation doesn't really directly impact coverage, but there are a few benefits that I want to highlight. And I think the most important one right now is the Transitional Coverage for Emerging Technologies program, which was put into place about a year and a half ago. This is a program that provides a potential for early national Medicare coverage based upon it's an early consultation program for manufacturers to work with CMS prior to FDA issuing its marketing authorization to prepare for a national coverage analysis and presumably a national coverage determination that would be closely timed with market introduction. Currently, that program is small. Only a handful of program slots are open annually. And one of the ways they're limiting that is by requiring and opening the program only to devices that have a breakthrough device designation from FDA. So that is a benefit. Programs in its infancy. So far, they've done a couple of pilots, but only since the program has been officially launched, there's only been one device that has been reported to have been accepted into the pathway. Another thing people should understand is it's more likely than not, if you do go through the TSET pathway, that when you come out with a national coverage determination, it is going to be a national coverage determination that requires coverage with evidence development, which means that Medicare coverage is going to be contingent upon the manufacturer paying for and implementing a post-market data collection protocol that will be submitted to and approved by CMS. While we've seen early success in the pilot that manufacturers and CMS were able to agree on a evidence development protocol, that can sometimes complicate coverage discussions with private payers. So that is one thing to keep in mind. It should not be, I have breakthrough device designation, I should go for TSET. You really need to think strategically as part of your overall market access strategy, whether it really makes sense to go through the TSET program, potentially end up with a coverage policy that is contingent upon ongoing data collection. So that's the big thing right now when it comes to coverage is your eligibility for TSET. In the future, both Congress and CMS are considering potentially establishing programs that would more closely tie a coverage determination to a breakthrough device designation. There is legislation currently under consideration in Congress that would grant a automatic 4-year period of temporary national coverage for a device that has a breakthrough device designation, so long as there is already a Medicare benefit category that that technology fits into, and so long as there was not any undue risk to beneficiaries that CMS could point to and say that it's not in the best interest to make that technology available. But CMS, that is legislation that we have been working with Congress and CMS to develop over a number of years, and Congress is very hopeful that we will see action on that this year. And then also CMS is considering regulatory action to establish a more formal accelerated coverage pathway. So I note up at the top that the TCEP program is a sub-regulatory program, so it's only implemented through guidance. So it doesn't really establish any rights or mandates for coverage. CMS is looking at whether they would do what people are referring to as MCIT 2.0, related to the Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technologies regulation that was promulgated back in 2020 in the first Trump administration and subsequently reversed before it was implemented by the Biden administration. There were some operational challenges associated with MCIT 1.0 that CMS is working to address to make sure it would be a really workable pathway. But we're hopeful in the future that we could see something more formal, and the extent to which that may or may not be tied directly to an FDA benefit or FDA breakthrough designation is up in the air. So that's kind of the overview. Again, it's not as well as established as some of the benefits that you get from on the payment side, as Rudy highlighted. But I think there certainly is consideration being given at CMS to how they can rely upon breakthrough designation in the future when it comes to coverage reviews. Sandy, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. And we can go ahead and stop sharing the slides now. We'll transition here to our panel discussion. I have a series of questions. Oh, I'm wrong. We have to have Shri talk. Sorry, Shri. I almost jumped immediately to panel discussion. So let me introduce Shri Raghunathan, who's going to put all of this in context for us, right? We've just heard about all of the policy side of things. Shri's been living this path with the development of the technology at Noctrix Health. And so, Shri, why don't you give us a feel for what that real world experience has been like and what your path has been?
Fantastic. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity, and pleased to be here to share our experiences on behalf of Noctrix Health. So Noctrix is developing, like Sandy mentioned, a neuromodulation therapy. It's a wearable medical device that uses electrical nerve stimulation to treat restless leg syndrome. So RLS is an incredibly common medical condition. 1 in 10 adults suffer from RLS in the United States. It disrupts sleep severely. And much like any other condition that disrupts sleep, it has all the downstream consequences of poor sleep. And some of our patients wind up being really desperate, looking for last resort options. Dopamine agonists tend to be the mainstay of treatments. These are Parkinson's drugs. So when we went to the FDA, this was back in 2019, end of 2019, 2020, we made the case for why RLS is a chronically irreversible and debilitating condition. A number of these patients were restricted to just Parkinsonian drugs, which were causing dangerous side effects. Now, fast forward to 2025, 3 out of those 4 drugs have been taken away from the standard of care guidelines, thanks to some of those side effects and worsening of RLS over time. So patients really were left with just the off-label use of opioids. So we went to the FDA with early pilot clinical data that showed promise that neuromodulation of the peroneal nerve could actually improve RLS symptoms without any of those systemic adverse events. And our efficacy was comparable, if not better, than what some of those pharmaceutical agents had shown. So I believe, just double checking the dates here, we got our breakthrough designation in 2020, the summer of 2020. And our interactions with the FDA have been terrific. I think the breakthrough designation was very, very helpful in working with the agency very collaboratively on not just during the application process, but subsequently after that in planning the pivotal trial, the statistical plan, the biocompatibility, the testing. We were creating a brand new 21 CFR category, given that the device was going to go through a de novo 510K pathway with a clinical trial, since we did not have a predicate device identified. So it was very helpful to have these meetings with the FDA on a regular cadence. And I believe we had at least 4 or 5 of these, some of which we were able to perhaps get lucky and schedule on, as early as like a week's notice. So it was very helpful to get on multiple discussions with the review panel and the lead reviewer, just to make sure that we were on the same page. We eventually submitted all the clinical data, and the de novo was granted in the summer of 2023, spring of 2023. So that was April of 23 when we got that de novo granted. We then went for, unfortunately, on the breakthrough pathway, that's kind of the extent of what we were able to leverage, largely because there weren't any guidelines on how CMS were to operate within this framework of a breakthrough device, especially given between 2020 and 23, a lot had happened. We then applied for a HCPCS code, much like any other. Our device, again, for context, is an in-home use device. So we're what people would call a durable medical equipment, or DME. They have their own codes, which fall under the HCPCS codes for those that are familiar. So we went through a new code application and the regular pathway that any new DME device would take, given that there wasn't really a framework for breakthrough devices to go through a different pathway with CMS. And we wound up getting a new dedicated code for the device in October of 2024. So it became effective October 1 of 2024, and payment was assigned as well. In January, so just last year, Jan 2025, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine recognized Nidra, which is the product name of our technology, tonic motor activation, as part of standard of care to treat RLS. So we got included in the AASM standard of care guidelines, and that was largely a recognition of all of the clinical data, the randomized controlled trials, the meta-analyses that had been published, and real-world evidence as well that was continuing to build on the use of Nidra in patients with moderate to severe RLS. Particularly, we were going after our FDA label, which was patients who were refractory to some of the mainstay treatments, which is really where the biggest unmet need was. So since January of 2025, we have been included in the guidelines. We've got a code, we've got a payment assigned associated with that code. We've been working on a case-by-case basis with commercial, Medicare Advantage plans, and Medicare fee-for-service. However, we do not have an LCD or an explicit coverage policy from Medicare to date as of yet. Fast forward to 26 January, we've got thousands of patients on therapy. We actively service Medicare fee-for-service, commercial, VA, and Medicare Advantage patients. However, the lack of sort of a substantive policy does cause us to have to go through a case-by-case determination. And sometimes this winds up, causing incredible delays in the patients obtaining relief and having a shot at starting on Nidra therapy. This could be anywhere from 3 weeks to sometimes as long as 9 to 12 months by the time we're able to secure a prior authorization and ensure that the patient's able to access therapy. So, incredibly supportive of saying, hey, coverage policies tremendously help with access. We're continuing to build evidence in addition to all of the RCTs and clinical data that we've used to date, we are running the largest RLS real world evidence study, the largest RLS registry in the last decade. Over 334 patients that are already enrolled in the study, and we continue to, on a rolling basis, obtain data on how they're doing and how they're doing on their medication use, how they're sleeping. So it's incredibly valuable for us to work with the agency to ensure that there's a coverage policy or coverage determination that helps improve that pathway, the timeline between when a physician determines that this may be right and prescribes the therapy to when the patient can actually realistically start. On a practical basis, how this impacts, our day-to-day on the ground is if pretend you're a physician prescribing or considering options for your patients that have exhausted dopamine agonists. So as of January 2025, dopamine agonists are no longer standard of care. So despite that, a vast majority of our patients have been on dopamine for over 2 decades when they go see a doctor. Your choices are to either get them, presumably after ruling out iron deficiency, your choices today are to pretty much put them on a gabapentinoid, which has a black box warning from the FDA, or get them on an off-label opioid, methadone or oxycodone. Or, of course, you have an FDA-approved breakthrough device treatment, which is Nidra therapy. Now, the reality is, if physicians were to prescribe Nidra and understand that there may be an indeterminate period of time that the patient has to wait to get the therapy, that changes the course of treatment. So you may have to keep that patient waiting for 3 weeks or 6 months or 9 months. That potentially changes what the physician may need to do, and that impacts patient and physician quality of life. So we certainly feel like having expanded coverage through explicit policies can be beneficial for all. Eager to contribute to this discussion. I'm in no means an expert as some of my other panelists here on the nuances of how CMS and the regulatory bodies see this, but I'm happy to share our lived experience through Noctrix. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Shri. Really appreciate that story because I think that encapsulates a lot of what we've been talking about here and takes us to the core question of the webinar, right? What keeps innovative technologies from patients? What is this? What's going on with this entire process, and where are the policy opportunities to reduce the barriers that are faced by manufacturers? And particularly manufacturers that are trying to address significant unmet clinical needs. So we'll start with the panel here, and I just have a question for you that comes back to the main point. I'd love it if everyone went through, like, what do you think that the challenges are in achieving Medicare reimbursement for breakthrough devices? Rudy, Dan, this is really your wheelhouse.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, I can start. So I look at it as through the lens of Medicare reimbursement in terms of the 3 buckets that we always talk about, right? Coverage, coding, and payment, and talk about the challenges in each. So from a payment standpoint, I think you guys heard me talk. The core problem is that the Medicare payment systems, they're slow to value new technology. So you saw how on the bundled payment side for DRGs and APCs, they're based on costs of older, cheaper technology. So that's that is a big challenge, and it's a challenge not just for breakthrough devices. It's going to be a challenge for non-breakthrough devices. Having breakthrough adds some of those flexibilities that I talked about, but the core issue, again, from a payment standpoint, is the fact that these devices are going to be in bundles that are really slow to value the new technologies. And then from a coverage standpoint, I think there are a number of challenges. One we haven't touched on, but there's this issue related to benefit categories, right? So before even CMS looks at your clinical data, you have to fit into a benefit category. And there's some breakthrough devices more recently that don't fit neatly into those benefit categories. So a lot of the digital therapeutics, the prescription digital therapeutics, well, if you don't fit into a benefit category, Medicare cannot legally pay for you. They can't cover you. So that's going to be an issue, and that's certainly that applies to breakthrough devices. And then the data and the evidence, right? So from a CMS standpoint, they have a different standard of review than the FDA. The FDA's job is to determine if the device is safe and if it does what it claims it's effective. But and for breakthrough devices, that might mean looking at a lower level of evidence. So maybe approving certain things on surrogate endpoints or smaller data sets. From a Medicare standpoint, where they're looking to see if the product is reasonable and necessary or improves health outcomes for Medicare patient population, that data that gets you breakthrough might not be sufficient, right? And that's a significant challenge. And then from a coding standpoint, breakthrough doesn't help you at all, right? And I mean, I think from a breakthrough standpoint, from a coding standpoint, you have to go through the processes, whether it's a CPT code and it's a long process or a HCPCS code. So that's always going to be a challenge that isn't really helped by having breakthrough status.
I agree with everything Rudy said. The only thing I would really add is that, I try to tell people you need to think about breakthrough as breakthrough little b and breakthrough with a capital B. Breakthrough with a capital B is something that actually has a breakthrough designation from FDA, and as we've talked about on this webinar, there are certain things that follow that. But we also, are always talking about how do we speed up the process and get patients access and their physicians access to technology more quickly and kind of address this lag between FDA market approval and ultimately it being available to patients because you have coverage coding and payment established. So, and that kind of exists for all, whether you're a big B breakthrough or a little B breakthrough. They pretty much the challenges are the same.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make, Dan, is that there's a breakthrough device designation, which has its particular criteria founded at the FDA level, and yet there are definitely significant improvements to unmet clinical needs for patients that may fall into that outer ring of little b breakthrough. They are really novel and substantive ways to address a particular clinical problem, but it might not meet that criteria. I wonder, Nancy, if you can talk to that navigation within FDA of how something gets to breakthrough and falls within the program or falls outside it.
Well, I hate to say this, but it's different with different groups. When you're with, like, for OHT6, for example, orthopedics, they were very enthusiastic about the program. Rear Admiral Pete took over that OHT when they did the combination for OPEC, and she really wanted to use all the tools. And of course, cardiovascular, whatever, those people are used to dealing with those types of technologies. But if you look at how it breaks down later, some of the other groups don't use it as much, or they don't, they're, I don't know if its industry has not done a good job of positioning the product, but there are other areas at FDA you would have expected to see it where you don't see the numbers. So, I'd have to say it's on a case-by-case basis, almost by the group and also by the leadership there.
Thanks, Nancy. Let's back up a second and talk about, like, what are some of the common myths you hear about the breakthrough device designation? I think Dan, Rudy, you've talked on this a little bit. Nancy, you too. What would you say people come to you saying about, oh, I've got this amazing new device that we're having development?
I'll just reinforce what Rudy said. On the innovator side, I think it's this misconception that it's a golden ticket when it comes to coverage or reimbursement, which kind of came about because of the original MCIT 1.0 regulation. And it is not a golden ticket. You still have a lot of work to do when it comes to market access planning that you need to do, even if you have a breakthrough device designation from FDA. The other thing I think for policymakers, we encounter this is that there's a real misconception that there's a lower bar for approval or clearance for a breakthrough device designation. And I think this is because it gets equated with the accelerated approval program on the drug side, which has been somewhat controversial, particularly related to the coverage determinations that were made related to certain Alzheimer's drugs. For the accelerated approval program on the drug side, it really is focused on approving things based upon surrogate endpoints. But on the device side, the breakthrough program is much more about a process and prioritization than it is about really changing the endpoints or criteria. There is some balance between pre-market and post-market studies that Nancy talked about, but they are really two different programs, and that's not really appreciated by a lot of policymakers.
Hmm. Yeah, Shri, do you want to speak to that? What was your experience around developing the evidence for nidra therapy?
Yeah, I think one common misconception that comes up in some of the determinations on whether it was MCIT or TCET now is around the lack of sort of clinical evidence in some of these breakthrough designations, et cetera. Our experience has been quite on the contrary. Like even in order to make that case for, this is a breakthrough treatment, we had to go in with clinical evidence on why did we believe that tonic motor activation therapy could produce comparable, if not better, clinical outcomes compared to the standard of care, which was, back when we did the breakthrough application, dopamine agonists were the standard of care, FDA approved and still are FDA approved to treat RLS. In addition to some of that pilot data that we did, we again worked with the agency on a randomized controlled trial plan and engaged, their feedback early and often on, what outcomes do we want to use. We compared ourselves apples to apples to standard of care, so same exact outcomes as what the pharmaceutical agents had used. So it went through what I would think was a fairly rigorous and standard process for any new technology going through a regulatory review that did not have a predicate. So I think there's often sort of a misconception that, hey, you could get this through a 510(k) with a substantial equivalence and no clinical data. I'm not aware of too many breakthrough devices that have tried to go down that route. I think most, if not all, wind up going through clinical evidence. And, usually we also follow up and continue to do real world evidence studies on the back end of an FDA clearance or approval or a grant. And that helps continue to build that body of evidence of why the therapy is effective.
Great. And I think that's a good point to make here, Shri, because we've got these breakthrough devices. Many of them are coming through FDA with clinical evidence. I'd love if everyone here on this panel kind of put your policymaker hat on and said, like, what are the pros and cons of linking some of these programs, these payment programs, these coverage programs to the breakthrough device designation itself?
I think so. From a pro standpoint, I think a big one would be aligning CMS and FDA, right? I think, the biggest win is that it would stop kind of, I don't want to say the government speaking with two voices, but getting some type of, or at least reducing the friction where the FDA says, hey, this is life-saving, and CMS says, okay, well, I want to make sure this is reasonable and necessary for a Medicare patient population. So aligning that voice, I think, would be a kind of significant pro there. Another one is some of the early engagement under the TCET pathway. Obviously, that's very limited to a number of devices, and it's really new. But to the extent that that does take off, that's certainly a pro. Being able to have that coverage conversation earlier, getting predictability in coverage before you launch, that's certainly a significant advantage. I think from a con standpoint, the TSIP program as well, like we heard, it's very limited right now. It's limited to a handful of devices. So, it's exclusive, and it's still kind of TBD what happens there, but it could be beneficial. And then from a payment standpoint, there's, I didn't really talk about this, but there's this fiscal cliff. So the add-on payments are temporary, right? So they're 2 to 3 years, and then CMS will get that data and they'll recalibrate the bundle. Now, the problem is after that 2 to 3 year period where they kind of take the training wheels off and there's no add-on payments, the device cost isn't just folded into the bundle. The base payment rate typically just increases slightly because CMS averages your device into this big pool of other cheaper cases and other things in the bundle. So oftentimes there's this add-on payment, and then after the add-on payment, it's a significant reduction in payment to the hospitals in the bundle, even though the bundle is recalibrated. So those are just a few that I can think of.
Dan, any comments for you, pros and cons?
Yeah, I mean, it's the one thing this is conversations we have all the time is um, there is a risk, and I'm always fearful of unintended consequences. And to the extent that, the FDA's determination about whether it's appropriate for a product to be marketed and CMS's determination about whether it's appropriate to cover and pay for that for Medicare beneficiaries are two really different determinations. So, while I agree that trying that it's a reasonable thing to think about in terms of trying to address this lag between FDA clearance or approval and making it available in the Medicare program, I also do fear that we could bringing CMS around the table or giving CMS more of a stake in determinations that FDA is making could have negative implications down the road, and we don't want to slow down the FDA process or have things, regulatory criteria coming into to FDA's determination that are really tied to the Medicare program, if that's going to mean slowing things down on the FDA side versus speeding them up on the CMS side.
Mm-hmm. Got it. All right, well, we've got about 2 minutes left here. Rudy, I did want to point to, we do have one question in the Q&A. If I don't know, I feel like it's totally your wheelhouse if you want to address that.
Or how do I
About the
access?
May 1st regulatory deadline for NTAP and whether there's some opportunities for reform there.
Oh, yeah. So I mentioned something related to conditional approval. So for certain antimicrobial products, these life-saving antibiotics that have a status from the FDA that is called a Qualified Infectious Disease Products QIDP, CMS conditionally approves them, so they can miss the FDA approval deadline, and they potentially could still get NTAP payments. Typically, it's a quarter after their FDA approval. And this is something that CMS has said, okay, we're kind of going to see how it works for QIDPs, and then we'll see if we want to expand it. I think the medical device community, especially the breakthrough community, would probably say, okay, you've had enough time now to evaluate it, so give it to us because it works. So that's something where there is clear precedent, and that is something that they could that they could potentially do. So
There,
that's what I was referring to.
I would add that there is legislation that's been introduced in Congress that would direct CMS to implement conditional approval for the circumstances that Rudy is describing. And Nicole, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to talk about that with you.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up here. Dan, thank you so much for talking to what's happening from a coverage and a legislative perspective. Rudy talking about NTAP and pass-through payments. Nancy on the FDA and regulatory side, and Shri really giving us that flavor of what this has been like as an entrepreneur and as a manufacturer. Appreciate everyone's time today, and I wish you a very happy New Year. Thanks so much.